Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
It is that time of year when waterfowl hunters are gearing up for the upcoming season. And matter of fact, by the time you're listening to this, the season will be underway in some areas, certainly in Canada, and maybe a few early goose opportunities out there as well by the time you're listening to this. One of the decisions that we as waterfowl hunters have to make as we get to this time of year is, of course, deciding whether we're going to hunt, whether we're going to hunt ducks and geese and whatever other types of hunting license we're going to purchase for the upcoming season. And that really goes beyond waterfowl. If we're going to hunt small game, big game, migratory birds, those type of questions start running through our mind as hunters about the type of licenses we're going to buy and whether it's going to be a package license and so forth. This year, waterfowl hunters in a couple of states in the Central Flyway are going to have some options that when it comes to duck hunting regulations or duck hunting licenses that they've not had before. And so that's going to be a bit of sort of a new revelation, a new thing for some hunters that are going to be in the Central Flyway. And I know others are going to be hearing about it as well. So this is actually a pretty exciting development, somewhat of an experimental two-tier license system as it's being called. And I know waterfowl hunters are going to start hearing about it. It will certainly be relevant for hunters in those two states where it will occur. And so we wanted to bring on a couple of the folks that are most closely associated with the rollout of this two-tier license system and have them talk to us about it and give you, our listeners, an opportunity to learn about it as well. And so those two people that are going to be joining us here are Rocco Murano, Senior Waterfowl Biologist with South Dakota Game, Fish, and Parks Commission. Rocco, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
And then Matt Garrick, Waterfowl Program Manager with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
In your introductions, or my introductions of you, I've kind of identified the two states that are in play here, South Dakota and Nebraska. And we're going to talk about why those two states and where we are with regard to this experimental license system, two-tier license system, what it is, what are all the different questions that people are going to be asking about it. Before we get into that, however, I want to ask each of you just to tell us a little about what you do for your respective agency, what position you're in, and then kind of what you do for that agency. Rocco, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I'm the Senior Waterfowl Biologist for South Dakota Game, Fish, and Parks. So I'm responsible for harvest regulation development, habitat research, and programmatic development in a lot of cases. I also sit on the Central Flyway Technical Committee and the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture Technical Committee. So I'm kind of plugged into the habitat and regulation world. Any research projects that have wetlands or waterfowl or migratory birds in them, I kind of am a liaison from the agency. I also work a lot with banding. We band mourning doves, ducks, and Canada geese in South Dakota. So we work a lot with banding and banding data. Rocco,
you've been with the South Dakota Game and Fish for quite a number of years, right? Remind me how long you've been there?
Yeah, I actually started with the department in 2006. So about 15 years now, 16 years, and kind of worked my way up through the private lands and habitat world. And then in 2010, I took over the reins as the Senior Waterfowl Biologist.
I don't know if you'll like me pointing this out, but you are probably ascending to become one of the senior people among your Central Flyway partners, your reps, right? That happens quick, doesn't it?
Wasn't that long ago I was the new guy, and now I'm almost one of the old men. So it's I've been on the committee since 2010, and it's been a great experience.
And sort of at the other end of the spectrum, I want to talk to Matt now and get him to introduce himself to our listeners and what you do for Nebraska.
Yeah, so I'm the Waterfowl Program Manager. So I'm Rocco's counterpart for Nebraska. A lot of the same job duties, charged with research and management of waterfowl in the state. Serves as the tech rep for the Flyway tech section, and I'm not on the PPJV, but I'm on the technical committee for the Rainwater Basin.
And you've been in your position for what, a year, or is it even a year yet?
About 6 months. So.
6 months. So, all right. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us here. And I'll take this opportunity to try to piece together a few things for folks. That we've talked about hunting regulations a fair bit here on the podcast. We're certainly going to do a bit more of that as we get into the upcoming season as new regulations are recommended. One of the things I want to point out here is that Matt and Rocco, in your positions, you work closely through the Flyway Council, specifically the technical section of the Flyway Councils, with the federal partners that have ultimate responsibility for managing migratory bird populations, setting harvest regulations for migratory bird populations to ensure that our harvest levels are consistent and compatible with what those populations can sustain. And so you two guys, there's 49 or so or more if we count the folks north of us in Canada and their partnership with kind of this continental management of the resource that collaborate on setting harvest regulations at the overarching kind of federal framework. You guys have input into that process. And that really is what brings us to this particular conversation, this particular topic, where within those collaborative meetings, those collaborative partnerships with the Fish and Wildlife Service, you all discuss things like license systems, duck regulations, goose regulations, all sorts of migratory bird regulations, and the licenses in this case that we're going to be talking about have become a topic over a number of years. And in terms of whether we can do something a little bit different with some of our licensing structures. And so y'all made it happen. Y'all actually were able to get agreement on an experimental approach to offering a different license structure in a couple of states in the Central Flyway. And so that's what we're going to talk about. All of that has to happen through that federal-state collaboration. So Rocco, I want to start with you then to paint more of that backstory on why this was of interest. We're basically going to be talking about a system where we have two different types of licenses. And so maybe to start with here, Rocco, tell us the basics of what those two licenses are going to be, how they're going to differ, and then kind of what's the impetus behind that. So give us I'm sure you've talked about this a lot. So give us your description of what we have and what we're trying to accomplish with it.
You bet, Mike. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to Mark Vertiska. This was actually his brainchild back in, at least back to 2014, if not 2012. I remember starting to talk about this. We've been trying to get traction on this idea since that time, and there's been some kind of larger priorities in the Flyway, related to AHM and mallard regulations and things like that kind of took center stage, and we had to wait till that was over. And also we had to get some human dimensions work done to help to justify the need for this experiment. But yeah, I just wanted to give Mark credit. That's actually who Matt replaced after he went to a different position. So, but as far as the overall, I guess, idea is to give hunters and prospective hunters an option to try duck hunting or to duck hunt without the need to identify ducks on the wing. And there's been several human dimensions projects over the last 10 years that has identified duck identification, especially on the wing, as a barrier to participation in duck hunting. And with declining duck hunter populations, that's an issue. If we don't have conservationists out there participating to support the North American model of wildlife management, those resources won't be there. And with the recent update to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, including the human user as a co-equal goal, that was a large driver to this as well, as managing not only waterfowl populations but hunter populations, and that's a big paradigm shift, both in the field and with hunters. But that's what we're trying to do is create simplify regulations and create a way that hunters can choose that tier, which is a simplified regulation where you shoot 3 ducks, any sex or species. If you so choose, you can choose the traditional tier, which in our case we call tier 1, where you have all the normal bag restrictions, sex and species, all the opportunity that affords. But if you're not comfortable or just don't want to have to identify ducks on the wing, you can choose tier 2 and go out there during the season and shoot your 3 ducks and be happy, participate. You buy a duck stamp, you buy a license, you support conservation, but you don't have that burden or that worry of making a mistake, basically.
Rocco, we talk about human dimensions here, and that when we say human dimensions, we're essentially talking about sort of the interface, the intersection between the human users as well as the wildlife resource. And in particular, in this case, you can look back through the years and waterfowl managers such as yourself and Matt and all your counterparts, as you're thinking about duck regulations, and as our federal partners are thinking about duck regulations, one of the things that has always flavored those conversations, no matter how far back you go, has been trying to accommodate the interest and needs of our hunter constituents, while also obviously keeping an eye on the sustainability, the health of waterfowl populations. And so we're trying to achieve these dual goals of satisfying the needs and interest of our hunter populations, yet also being compatible with with what our habitat and population systems can support. And I'm glad you brought up the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, because it and even before it really, at least the recent update, we were starting to think a bit more explicitly and deliberately about asking those questions of hunters. What determines your level of satisfaction? What are the hindrances to you, or what are the hindrances to new hunters becoming engaged? And if I think back to the time whenever I was a young hunter, one of the things that I always had with me when I was in the blind was one of those ducks on the wing identification manuals, because that's really important. We had a conversation last year about the importance of duck identification in avoiding violations. And when you start talking about all the different species of ducks that people may encounter, and especially when you layer in different, in some for a couple of species, some, or maybe just for one species right now, sex-specific regulations. In the past, there were some additional sex-specific regulations for other species, but yeah, it becomes a little intimidating if you're inexperienced. And so I remember first hearing about this idea of a reduced bag limit, but without any sex or species restrictions. And I said, that would have been pretty cool back in the day whenever I first started hunting, going out there without having to worry about violating the law by shooting more than is allowed for any certain species. So I'm glad to see it's at this point, and really excited to see it be kind of rolled out here in these 2 states. So Matt, I want to go to you and follow up a little bit on what Rocco was talking about with regard to declining hunter numbers. Is that for our listeners that may not be aware, what can you tell us about kind of how widespread that is? Are we talking about just sort of in certain areas, in certain states? I mean, what's to your understanding, how consistent is that, and how long has that decline in waterfowl hunters been occurring?
Yeah, it's definitely pretty consistent, and over about the last 20 years, Nebraska and South Dakota have both seen about 50% declines in the numbers of waterfowl licenses being purchased in their respective states. But it's definitely not just restricted to Nebraska and South Dakota. It's across North America.
So as we start talking to hunters through these social science human dimensions projects, and we learn about all the different potential barriers, with maybe this being one of those, are there other notable barriers? Are there other how does this complement other efforts that are going on to recruit, reactivate, retain waterfowl hunters? How does this fit within the grander, I guess, scheme of those efforts?
There's definitely a number of barriers, and they really vary whether you're talking about our current hunters or prospective hunters that haven't waterfowl hunted before. So our current hunters, one of the biggest barriers to them is access to places to hunt, which is a barrier for all hunters, but for hunters that aren't currently hunters or anglers or people that don't hunt at all, one of the biggest barriers for them is identification, which is kind of where this whole program stemmed from. So I guess there's just different ways to attack those different barriers, but this is one. Regulations or identification is one that we have a lot of control over and can make changes to try to make it or reduce that barrier. But access to lands, that's not really a barrier we can effectively change without a lot of money. So this is just something that we can do rather easily.
So I want to stay with you here, Matt, and we're going to let's dive into this 2-tier license option in a bit more detail, recognizing it as one option that's being explored to see if it encourages and provides, if it opens a door for new hunters to try waterfowl hunting. I think that would be a great thing. I mean, we all as waterfowl hunters love the opportunity to get in the marsh and harvest waterfowl, and there's all sorts of reasons that we could talk about of why we love it. And anything that we can do here to give other people an opportunity, maybe make it easier for them to get involved, I think is worthwhile. So now, I guess the other thing to say here is that this is not going to be restricted to just new hunters. So kind of walk us through this, even existing hunters or potential new hunters, when they go to purchase their license this year for waterfowl. What are they going to encounter differently? What type of decisions are they going to have to make on whether they select which of these two license they select?
So it's going to be the same in that regard. As far as licenses they purchase, they'll still purchase the same small game and habitat and federal duck stamp. Where this comes into play is actually when they register for HIP. So when they register for HIP, they're going to have a question where they're asked, in Nebraska specifically, do you plan on hunting ducks? And yes or no. And if they select yes, they'll then be prompted to select either tier 1 or tier 2. And that's when they're basically selecting a tier. And so it'll be reflected in their HIP number. Their HIP number will say, if they select tier 1, it'll be T1 and then followed by their HIP number. Or if they select tier 2, it'll be T2 followed by their HIP number. So that makes it pretty easy for us and law enforcement to identify tier 2 or tier 1 hunters.
Tier 1 is the current 6 duck daily bag with all applicable species and sex restrictions. Tier 2 is the one that allows them to harvest 3 ducks of any sex or species on a daily basis, right?
Yep, that's correct.
That means if they encounter 3 canvasbacks, they could, and if they have that tier 2 license, they could harvest 3 canvasbacks. They could harvest 3 pintails. If someone in Nebraska or South Dakota were fortunate enough, they could harvest 3 black ducks or 3 model ducks, which we don't obviously expect that to happen. But that's the way that tier 2 license would happen, right? So you are eliminating those decisions you're simplifying the decisions is essentially what you're doing. You don't have to worry about the number of species or the sex of the species. You're just saying, I get to harvest 3 ducks. So, all right, well, that's interesting that it occurs at the level of their HIP registration. So, Rocco, remind people what that is. That's something that waterfowl hunters have to do anyway. So let's talk about that a little bit as they go there and indicate their interest in or their intent to hunt waterfowl, and they're prompted there with HIP. Remind us what that is, I guess, and who has to do that.
Yeah, so the states collect HIP data, which is a hunter information program, and that is a way for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states collectively together through the flyways to collect information on harvest rates, harvest composition through the parts collection survey. If anybody's ever had to or been asked to complete the harvest diary or send in wings to the wing bee, that's all part of the HIP. And that's why those questions actually form the sample frame for who they're going to go further with and ask if they will collect wings and do the diary to help them figure out who actually harvests ducks that can help with that process. So that and it goes beyond ducks, because obviously you're looking, when you get those HIP questions, you're asked about mourning doves and cranes, any migratory bird. But for the things that we're dealing with here, it's we're talking about ducks. So and we're actually going to basically copy the parts collection and diary system that some hunters on the air here are familiar with, and do basically a mini parts collection, a mini diary survey for those folks that happen to choose tier 2 to actually have an apples to apples comparison of harvest, both composition and number, to help evaluate this system.
What about hunters under the age of 16? Rocco, I'll stay with you for this one. How does this affect them? If our hunters are taking their kids, their sons or daughters hunting, and they're under the age of 16, what type of decisions does this create for them?
So in South Dakota, all youth hunters still have to purchase a migratory bird certification, which is the HIP registry. I don't know if that's the case in Nebraska or not, but in South Dakota, we're still going to be collecting that information from youth hunters. And honestly, just speaking of youth hunters, I mean that's a huge demographic that we're trying to have take advantage of this program. It's great. You can take a youth hunter out. I know my daughter, I already registered her for the 3-duck option, and I can't wait to take her out and just be able to say, Audrey, shoot 3 ducks. Where we'll look at them, we'll identify them when we get them back in hand, and we'll go through what it was. And it's going to take a lot of pressure off of her. And for a lot of people, it takes pressure off the person that's actually mentoring or taking out either a youth hunter or an experienced duck hunter. It basically takes the pressure off those people to worry if their person that they're mentoring makes a mistake. I know I recently had a conversation with somebody that last year he took his son out. The first bird that came in and he shot was a hen pintail. And if anybody knows, in South Dakota in the early season, the ducks are brown. I mean, it just doesn't look like Texas, the Gulf Coast of Texas, where you see a nice sprig. So at that point, the decision that had to be made is, do we go home, or are we just really careful? And this takes that away, so that hunter would then just be able to shoot 2 more ducks, and be done, and not have to worry about it.
That's a great segue to one of the other questions that I know people will have here is, all right, well, can you hunt with the regular license, the tier 1 license, and then your daughter or son hunt with the tier 2 license, the 3-bird option? The answer to that is yes, right? Absolutely.
That's really almost the point of this, is we want people to take folks out and help them. If that's a tool that can be used to help mentor people, that's what we want. I mean, there's no reason, at least from a law enforcement standpoint, why folks shouldn't be able to do that. We have had questions about things like swapping birds, but that occurs now. I mean, whenever you have a species or a sex restriction, that occurs anyway. So it really doesn't exacerbate that. It's an issue that occurs right now.
Matt, I'll come to you for this. Let's say that I register for tier 2, the 3-bird limit, and then midway through the season, I say, hey, well, I'm not seeing a great variety of ducks. I can identify the ones that I'm seeing. I would rather, and I'm seeing a lot of ducks, I would really like to be able to take advantage of the 6-bird bag under tier 1. Would I be able to switch in the middle of the season if I went and purchased another license?
No, you can't. You cannot switch tiers between or within the same season. So once you've registered from the HIP, you can't re-register again and switch tiers. So you are stuck with that tier for the whole season.
I guess that's a good point. I probably I guess the idea that was running through my mind is I would go buy a different license, but if I did that, I would be prompted to register for HIP again, and then that's when it would see my prior registration for the what would be the tier 2. So yeah, it's important that folks understand understand the trade-offs, quite frankly, that you're going to be making when selecting tier 1 or tier 2. And okay, so that's important. Once you select for this year, then you have to stay with that for the remainder of this hunting season, but you could switch next year, right? This is going to be going on for 4 years. There's no requirement that you shift from, let's say you have a new hunter and they register for Tier 2 this year, the 3-bird limit. There's no requirement that they then graduate, so to speak, to the Tier 1 license at any point in the future. Is there, Matt?
Nope. So as long as Tier 2 is offered, you could select that every year if you wanted to.
Matt, I'm now realizing that I need to back up and ask you the same question that I did of Rocco. For hunters under the age of 16 in Nebraska, what are the rules regarding their requirement to purchase a license or register for HIP?
It's different in Nebraska than South Dakota in that residents under the age of 16 do not need to buy hunting licenses or register for HIP as long as they are hunting with a licensed adult. However, if they want to register as a Tier 2 hunter, they do need to register for HIP. But additionally, for non-residents under the age of 16, they do need to have purchase the required hunting licenses and register for HIP, whether they want to be a Tier 1 or a Tier 2.
They just have to register for HIP.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I've kind of mentioned a couple of things here. Well, several times we've talked about it being available in Nebraska and South Dakota. It's not available in any other states at this time. Rocco, how did we get to that point? I mean, was that's some discussions there at the Central Flyway. How was that decision made?
So at the beginning of the discussions, like I said, Nebraska was kind of the driver of this original idea, and there was a kind of a call through the process of states that might be interested. I certainly was interested right away, and I guess I was a Flyway early adopter, but and we also had to pick states where this is where we could prove that this is not going to be have an undue impact on species that do have concerns. So what we did is a worst case scenario through the parts collection, where we actually looked at real bags that come in from hunters, and we basically did a scenario analysis to see, okay, if a person shot 2 pintails when 2 pintails were available, we say automatically they're going to shoot 3. What does that look like when you have a frequency of 2? And we did that for both Nebraska and South Dakota for all the species, hen mallards, Scott, pintail, canvasback, things like that. And it was just, it was not biologically significant at all. It was literally, if not a handful, hundreds instead. We weren't talking thousands of birds. So we could basically show that in South Dakota and Nebraska, the biological impact was not going to be something that was of concern. And also, we are also 2 states where we had some of the highest rates of loss of duck hunters, 50% loss since the late 90s. So those are some of the 2 factors. And I think, frankly, some of the other states are looking to see how this works. The other states and I know I've talked with multiple biologists from multiple flyways, and they're certainly eagerly looking at this and seeing, what's the administrative burden, what's the how does the evaluation go? And so, yeah, we're excited. I certainly hope at the end of this that we have the opportunity to go operational on something like this. But I would assume that other states would have to, as with Teal evaluations, kind of evaluate their way into the program, because there's some states where perhaps this won't work. But especially in Nebraska and South Dakota, it was not a biological issue, and we certainly have a hunter population issue. So that's how it happened. And so the actual process is, the recommendation comes up through the Flyway, through the Flyway Council to the SRC, which is the Service Regulations Committee. And at that point, it's vetted through the other flyways prior to that. And basically, once the other flyways agree that the experiment is warranted and okay, then the SRC has a chance to weigh in, and they agreed to allow the experiment to occur. The Central Flyway has had an interest in simplified regulations for R3, which is recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters, for a long time. If any hunters on the air recall, the last major experiment was the Hunter's Choice experiment. Back in the mid-2000s. It's kind of a similar vein, just a different way to get about it, where you could actually, it was a reduced limit, but the species and sex restrictions were kind of all aggregated, I guess is the best way to put it. So if anybody remembers the Hunter's Choice experiment, that was another kind of angle on this question, but we're just taking it a bit further.
Rocco, there's there are several things that I want to unpack there. I think it's really important. We talk a lot all the time, as much as we can, about how waterfowl management, every aspect of waterfowl management in North America is rooted on some scientific, some piece of scientific information. It could be recent, it could be historical scientific information, understanding of waterfowl ecology, the wealth of work that's been done to understand the effects of harvest on waterfowl population dynamics. There are very few decisions that we make in the waterfowl management enterprise that are not based in whole or in part on some empirical information. And this is certainly one of those. And I think this is important for people to realize that I've sat in the back of the room for many flyway technical committee meetings. Ducks Unlimited doesn't have a seat at the official decision-making table, but we participate in some of the discussions, and I have witnessed the discussions, the debates that have occurred, but between the states and federal managers regarding different ideas for harvest regulations. And at the end of the day, things just won't move forward unless there's some agreement, some way to support them with empirical information, or to evaluate them empirically. And this particular two-tier system here includes both of those. So what I want to do is sort of pull out what you were talking about in terms of how you evaluated that worst case scenario to kind of anticipate the risk before this was implemented. And you mentioned that it was made possible because we have parts collection survey data, and those data come from hunters. We have talked about those on multiple podcast episodes here before, and talked about the importance of hunter participation in those surveys. This type of experimental license system is made possible because we have the data from hunters that have participated in those harvest surveys. Rocco, I don't know if this is true or not. I feel confident saying that the decision to move forward with an experimental license of this type would have been incredibly difficult to move forward without those data. It may not have even happened because you would have had the inability up front to kind of evaluate the worst possible scenario, but it certainly was made much easier, and we're able to go into it with a data-based idea of the potential biological ramifications as you talked about.
Yeah, I don't believe it would have been possible. That's the number one question, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and rightly so, is how is this going to impact the population? And we had a direct way to measure or to estimate on a worst case basis what that impact would be. And once it was shown that it had no biological impact, the value to potentially recruiting, retaining, and reactivating hunters really especially in the SRC's or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's view, outweighed any potential impact on the population, which was deemed to be negligible. The sheer weight of the human dimensions research that has come down the pike in the last 10 years, plus the North American Waterfowl Management Plan emphasis on the hunter population, or the user, not even the hunter, but the human user, whether it be consumptive users or not, really tip the scales in favor of this experiment. And I know I'm excited to see how it works. The other part of this, that we kind of touched on earlier, is the different barriers and how they interact and how they interface with hunters. And the take-home message that I have with that is the two main ones that we have control over as an agency are access and regulations. And like Matt said, access is always top of mind, but it's extremely expensive and it's hard to scale. It's hard to scale at any level in a timely manner. It's kind of a slow, steady process. We have our three efforts. We have education, we have outreach, we have youth and mentoring programs, things like that. That's done on a hunter by hunter basis. It's a very it's a very important work, but it's hard to scale that as well. So this is a way that we can basically impact large numbers of people quickly and not very expensively. So we're trying to see if we can bend the needle and get more folks out there with a simplified regulation option. And it's my hope that we get more folks in the field with this. And honestly, I think that we're going to have even seasoned duck hunters that choose this option. We actually did a survey prior to implementing in the March 2020, and in South Dakota, up to 30%, roughly 30% of current duck hunters indicated that they would highly consider using this option, which actually surprised me. I didn't think it would be that high. So, I mean, there's a need or a desire out there, whether that's people that just don't know their ducks and never really intend to know their ducks, or if that's people that are perhaps getting older and their eyesight is failing them. I mean, there's a whole host of demographics this might serve.
That's a great segue to the next question I want to ask you, and I'm going to direct it to Matt. But before I ask that question, I did just want to reiterate our thanks to the waterfowl hunters that have participated in those harvest surveys. If you ever question whether your time in completing those surveys when you're asked to do, or whether it's worth your time to call in and report a band when you harvest one, I hope this episode, this discussion, the opportunity for us to experiment with different license systems and how it was so dependent upon those data. I hope this helps answer your question about whether your time and your participation in those surveys is important, because it's directly related to what we're being able to see here for the next 4 years in Nebraska and South Dakota. Now, Matt, something Rocco mentioned there made me imagine the responses that people may have regarding this, in that, you're taking away the importance, or you're discounting the importance of people learning how to identify waterfowl species by using this simplified 3-bird bag. Now, one of the things that Rocco said there was that there may be some people whose eyesight is just failing, and without this opportunity, they would not, they can no longer identify waterfowl to species on the wing to begin with, right? But what about younger hunters, new hunters? What do you kind of say to that? People that might criticize it, saying that you're discounting the value or the importance of identifying species.
I mean, identification is really important. We realize that, but I think it's important to also realize as new people come into the sport, there's a lot of different species of ducks out there, and there's a good number with restrictions, and that can be intimidating to someone that doesn't know their ducks. And if that's the barrier that's stopping them from getting into hunting and contributing to conservation, that's something we want to remove from them. And I think it's important to realize that if they become a tier 2 hunter, they're getting out there and they're going to shoot a few ducks, and maybe they don't know them right away, but as they're going out there and hunting more and shooting these ducks, they're going to start to pick up on those differences between species and improve their identification skills to where they're hopefully to a point where they can then identify them in flight. Because, once they've shot one, they may not have known it on the wing, but then they get it and retrieve it and they see it in their hand and they say, oh, this is a pintail, or this is a hen mallard, or whatever. And okay. And then they might kind of start to pick up on the next one that they shoot. Like, oh, I think that was a pintail. And they go out and get it, and it was a hen mallard or something. So that they're hopefully improving their skills while they're out there. So this just gives them that opportunity.
Matt, I want to stay with you here, and because as we start to wrap up, I have a number of additional questions, and I know that each of your agencies is doing your level best to communicate as much as you can to your hunters to prepare them for this and what they're going to encounter whenever they go to purchase their license. Let me ask you a basic question here. Do either Nebraska or South Dakota have lifetime licenses?
Yes, we do. We do in Nebraska.
Okay. South Dakota?
We do not. Nope.
No lifetime license. But I think so. I'm a lifetime license holder in at least one state. And so one of the things that was running through my mind is, okay, well, how does this affect that? But again, I go back to what we started talking about earlier, is that this option is not selected during the license on the particular license. It's selected whenever you register for HIP, which I have to do anyway. I'm a lifetime license holder, but even in that state, when I go hunt migratory waterfowl or migratory birds, I have to register for HIP regardless of the possession of that lifetime license. Another question for you. I know there's one of the communication efforts that y'all are putting out right now is kind of laying out how different things are between the two licenses. And Matt, I guess I'll give you an opportunity here to help clarify something that I know you've been getting some questions about, and that is the possession limit. I know we talked previously about an infographic that y'all had shared, and again, part of the communication effort of your agencies, and you'd received some questions about possession limit. And so just, from a basic standpoint, what is the possession limit for those new hunters, let's say, that may not be familiar with waterfowl hunting, and they see this possession limit thing, and it differs between the two license structures? I mean, so just explain what that is and how it differs between the Tier 1 and Tier 2.
Mm-hmm. So the possession limit is 3 times the daily bag limit. So a Tier 2 hunter, the possession limit would be 9, and for a Tier 1 hunter, it'd be 18. So what the possession limit is, it doesn't mean that you can only shoot 9 or 18 ducks for the whole season. What that means is you can only have that many ducks in your freezer at any one time. So you can go out and shoot 3 daily bag limits over a course of 3 days, and you could fill your freezer. But if you start eating, say you've eaten 6 ducks, and so now you've got 12 in the freezer, you could go out and shoot another 6 if you're a Tier 1 hunter.
So teal hunting, the teal season, how does this affect that? I believe I remember correctly from an earlier conversation that South Dakota does not offer an early teal season, right, Rocco?
Correct.
But Nebraska does offer an early teal season. And the time when people are listening to this, that season will be just right around the corner. So Matt, talk about that. What, if someone is wanting to hunt teal during the early season, what type of decisions do they have to make with regard to this Tier 2 license? How does that interact?
The teal season is a special September teal season. I think the best way to think about it is it's a separate season from the regular duck season. So both Tier 1 and Tier 2 hunters can participate in the teal season, but they have to abide by those regulations. So what I mean by that is that a Tier 2 hunter can go out during the teal season and they can shoot 6 teal, but they are not allowed to shoot non-teal. So they have to abide by the regulation that only teal may be harvested during that season.
I suspect you're expecting there to be some confusion over that, because if I buy a Tier 2 license, the 3-bird license, I suspect there will be some teal hunters that think that there could be a couple of things that they imagine. One might be that they can shoot any duck species that they want during that teal season. The other might be that they think incorrectly that they can only harvest 3 teal. But just kind of to clarify, for either the Tier 1 or Tier 2 license, those individuals are eligible to hunt during the teal season, the special teal season, but they have to abide by those special teal regulations, which is only harvesting teal. And what's the bag limit there in your 6?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's our effort to try to clarify that for our listeners here. What about, Rocco, I'll direct this one to you. What about goose regulations? How does the Tier 2 license, this 2-tier license system, affect a person's ability to harvest geese and their bag limits and everything associated with goose hunting?
There's no impact to goose regulations at all. There's no impact to limits, season length, daily bag, nothing like that. It's duck specific. And the closest thing that we have to the issue with the teal season in South Dakota is we do have bonus blueing teal for the first 16 days of the regular duck season. But a person that selects the Tier 2 or the 3 duck option is not allowed to have bonus blueing teal. They can certainly shoot blueing teal, but they can't have 5 ducks. They still have to have the 3-bird bag. So that's just an important clarification in South Dakota as well. Because for the first 16 days, the duck limit functionally is 8 in South Dakota with 2 bonus blueing teal. But as far as geese, there's no impact.
And in terms of difference, are there any other differences between these two options, whether it be related to requirement to purchase duck stamps, or what about fee structure? Anything different there? And I know the answer to this, but we kind of need to hammer this one home again.
So there's no difference in fees or license or license requirements. The only difference is the choice, and we did that on purpose, so that when you evaluate this, the only difference, the only variable that is different in this evaluation is the actual choice the person made on bag limits. So that was really important to us to have the fee structure be the same.
And let's see. So anything, Matt, anything from Nebraska's standpoint?
No, I don't think so.
I guess the only difference too is that we are asking folks that do select that simplified option. We are asking them to participate in what I would consider a parts collection effort and a hunter diary effort. And so at least in South Dakota and Nebraska initially, every person that selects that option is going to have the opportunity to be mailed parts collection information and collection envelopes and a diary, and have the option to, or the opportunity to send us wings to help us with this effort. In a similar way to the normal parts collection, that's going to be critical that we get enough samples to be able to do a good, side-by-side evaluation of this regulation. And then another part of this is that we're going to be comparing trends in hunter recruitment, retention, reactivation, and hunter numbers with neighboring states. So we're going to be able to use them as kind of basically a control, because we all know there's other variables that affect duck hunter numbers. We're going into a dry period right now on the prairies. So if trends are down across the board, we want to be able to control for that. If trends are up across the board, we want to be able to control for that as well. So that's another part of this is before and after control design, basically, of the duck hunter numbers.
Thank you for talking about that data collection there, Rocco. That was another thing that I wanted to make sure we talked about, because as you say, that we used data beforehand to evaluate sort of the feasibility, the biological risk associated with going forward with this in experimental fashion. But then, as you said, it requires rigorous evaluation to make a determination on the back end what's going to happen with the license structure going forward with this option going forward. So 4 years, this 21-22 season is the first of those 4 years. I do kind of have to ask you, because you mentioned it, with developing drought on the prairies, right now we're going into a liberal season. Do you know what's going to happen if the drought continues and if we end up facing moderate or restrictive seasons, or is that a hypothetical that we haven't yet crossed yet?
Yeah, so that is built right into the evaluation plan. And if we drop into a restrictive package, the experiment pauses. And which basically it makes sense, because at that point you have a 3-bird bag and a 3-bird bag, and it's a little harder to evaluate. So if we do slip into if we're in a moderate package, it stays as normal. But if we do slip into a restricted package, then the experiment would pause until we get back into at least a moderate package. And that's, I mean, it makes sense both biologically and feasibility of the project and what you're going to get out of it.
Okay, so everyone that registers through HIP for the Tier 2 license will be asked to participate in a harvest survey, right?
Correct.
And then a sample of those individuals that indicated preference for the Tier 2 registration the Tier 1 option, a sample of those people will be asked to participate in the survey, right?
So there's already a sample through the federal parts collection survey. So we're going to use that sample to compare with the sample that we derive, because those folks wouldn't have been in the parts collection survey anyway, because they haven't necessarily duck hunted before. So they haven't gone through the process of going into the HIP process on the federal level. So we're going to just sample them directly and do a side by side. The only difference, literally, these are carbon copy efforts. Basically, the only difference is we're actually asking hunters when they put a wing in an envelope what they think it is, and that's something that's not done on the federal level. So we're actually going to ask them, what is your best guess? What do you think you just put in the envelope? And just as kind of a side question that we're trying to gauge what folks think they've shot. And so it should be really interesting.
So I have a couple of remaining questions. Rocco, you've been around this longer than Matt has, and so I think you might be in a better position to answer both of these here. Well, the first deals with law enforcement. I suspect some people may wonder how law enforcement is going to handle their enforcement responsibilities associated with this. We kind of touched on that earlier, with regard to the people that are possessing different tier structured licenses hunting together, and that's certainly encouraged, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but in terms of law enforcement's of your agency's law enforcement department kind of participating and being on board with this experimental system, what's that been like over the course of the discussions and the development over the years that it has taken to get us to this point?
Yeah, so I've been working with law enforcement for a number of years on this. That we've been working on this proposal and recommendation to SRC since at least 2014, if not earlier. So my law enforcement staff in South Dakota, it was not a surprise this was coming. They were aware of it and absolutely on board with the idea. I've had nothing but positive interactions with both law enforcement staff, field staff, and administration. A lot of them are avid duck hunters and see the decline and the small inconvenience of checking different bag numbers with different people in the blind to them is not a barrier to their law enforcement ability at all, and it's been nothing but positive.
Good. And then the final question is here, we've talked about the data being collected to evaluate the biological effect of this license system, and those data being collected along the way for 4 years. Rocco, and you were around for the Hunter's Choice experiment as well, so you saw the data collection and evaluation that went into that. Just kind of give our listeners, our hunters, an idea of the way those decisions are made once all the data are collected and the evaluation is performed. What are the things that you and your partners with the other states and then the Fish and Wildlife Service will be looking for to determine whether this becomes a viable option going forward, or for other states going forward?
So first of all, we're going to be looking to see if our parts collection effort matches or at least doesn't exceed our estimates for the worst case scenario, and analysis that we did on the current parts collection. So if it's in line or below the anticipated level of biological impact, that's a great thing, and that's what we're hoping for, is that this isn't going to be unduly impacting on any stock that has a species or sex restriction. The other part of it is going to be, there will be an economics portion of this. Are the administrative costs of implementing this worth the conservation dollars that you get? I mean, that has to be part of this evaluation as well. So we're keeping track of hours and all the expense that this experiment expends, and whether or not the juice is worth the squeeze is the best way to put it, I guess, that I can think of. And then of course we're going to be looking at hunter trends, and then the other big part of this is going to be a massive human dimensions component in the evaluation at the end. So we're going to be surveying people, both the traditional folks and the two-tier license or the second-tier license folks, throughout this process, to look at satisfaction, churn rate, hunter numbers, and whether somebody starts it in tier 1 and ends in or vice versa, starts in tier 1, ends in tier 2, or starts in tier 2 and ends in tier 1. How many times did you switch during this process? Why did you switch? So it's going to be a really multi-focused effort at the end to evaluate, and then at the end, the flyways and the service will have to decide whether this effort is meant to go operational, and whether we can expand to other states and flyways.
It's certainly an exciting time, and I have to offer my congratulations to your state, South Dakota, Nebraska, the entire Central Flyway Council and technical committees for working diligently on this. Dr. Mark Vratiska as well, certainly spearheading some of the thinking on this back in the day. And then Fish and Wildlife Service in being a key partner in going along with this as well and helping you with the evaluations up front, and then certainly on the back end. And it's another great example of the collaboration that occurs across all the different agencies and universities as well that will be involved in helping to evaluate some of this information. So we've covered a lot of information here, and I suspect that, invariably we've probably missed a thing or two. So I want to go to each of you and give you a chance to, offer any closing thoughts or cover anything that I might not have touched on. Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm just excited to see what happens next. Ready to start seeing those Tier 2 hunters come in.
Rocco, anything that we missed relative to South Dakota?
So I just want to highlight the opportunity for mentorship with this experiment. I think that's going to be a real plus for this regulation option is for folks to take inexperienced or youth out and not have the worry that they'll inadvertently violate. And for me, that's one of the most important parts of this is the potential for increasing mentorship, both adult mentorship and youth mentorship.
That's a great point, and it's a great point to close on, and we all look forward to seeing how this turns out. Thank you to each of you, Matt and Rocco, for joining us and sharing your time, and again, for all the hard work that you've done on this. So thank you, guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Rocco Murano, Senior Waterfowl Biologist with South Dakota Game, Fish and Parks Commission, and Matt Garrick, Waterfowl Program Manager for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. We thank them for their time and sharing the exciting news about this new opportunity for waterfowl hunters in Nebraska and South Dakota this year, and then the next 4 years, actually. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the work that he does on the podcast and getting it out to you. And to you, our listeners, we thank you for your time, and we thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.